Imagine an empire so vast, so powerful, that its very foundation was built not on discovery or industry, but on the systematic addiction of millions. For over a century, the British Crown engineered the largest, richest, and most destructive narcotics operation the world has ever seen. This wasn't some shadowy cartel. This was state-sponsored drug trafficking on an unprecedented scale, earning profits that eclipse even modern tech giants like Microsoft's Windows division. It's a truth so shocking it challenges our understanding of history, revealing how a seemingly benevolent power wielded opium not just as a commodity, but as a weapon of mass economic destruction. Prepare to uncover the blueprint for a global drug empire that reshaped nations and continues to echo in our world today. What if everything you thought you knew about British imperial power was a carefully constructed facade?
This isn't just a story about drugs. It's a chilling exposé of economic warfare waged with a poison. Britain didn't just want China's silver. It wanted to dismantle its very civilization. The strategy was brutally simple, yet devastatingly effective. Flood the market with opium, create a nation of addicts, drain its resources, and leave it vulnerable to exploitation. This was a blueprint for destabilization, a calculated assault designed to break the world's oldest continuous civilization from within. Backed by the full might of Parliament, protected by the Royal Navy's formidable fleets, and meticulously executed through the East India Company, this wasn't an accident of trade. It was a deliberate, institutionalized policy of addiction, a sinister precursor to modern geopolitical maneuvering. How could a nation priding itself on enlightenment descend into such calculated depravity?
As British opium flooded Chinese shores, a vast smuggling syndicate emerged, operating with brazen impunity. Corrupt Chinese officials, bribed by astronomical sums, turned a blind eye or actively facilitated the illicit trade. Foreign merchants established heavily fortified warehouses along the coast, particularly in Canton, Guangzhou, becoming the nerve centers of this booming black market. The British, exploiting loopholes and leveraging their naval superiority, became masters of evasion. Clipper ships, faster than any Chinese junk, would offload their illicit cargo onto smaller, swifter vessels that navigated the intricate river systems, disseminating the drug deep into the interior. The Qing dynasty's attempts to enforce its anti-opium edicts were constantly thwarted by this sophisticated, well-financed, and ruthlessly efficient network. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking, ensuring that, despite imperial prohibitions, the poison continued its relentless spread, claiming more and more victims.
The consequences of this relentless influx were catastrophic. Opium addiction swept through China like a plague, devastating all levels of society, from the lowest laborers to the highest mandarins. Families were torn apart, fortunes squandered, and productivity plummeted. The once vibrant and industrious nation began to rot from within, its social fabric unraveling under the weight of widespread addiction. The silver that had once flowed into China now poured out, exchanged for the deadly drug, leading to severe economic destabilization and rampant inflation. Imperial coffers dwindled, making it impossible to fund essential infrastructure or maintain a strong military. China, once self-sufficient and proud, found itself increasingly vulnerable, its people enslaved by a habit imposed by a foreign power. The sheer number of addicts became a testament to the brutal efficacy of Britain's economic warfare.
Faced with an escalating crisis, the Qing emperor and his court could no longer ignore the devastating impact of opium. Successive imperial decrees were issued, each more stringent than the last, attempting to ban the import, sale, and consumption of the drug. These edicts imposed harsh penalties, including execution for opium traffickers and users.
However, these laws proved incredibly difficult to enforce against the combined might of British economic power, rampant corruption, and the sheer scale of the smuggling operations. Despite genuine efforts by dedicated officials, the tide of addiction seemed unstoppable, undermining the very authority of the Dragon Throne. The Emperor's desperate attempts highlighted the moral bankruptcy of Britain's actions, forcing China into an impassable position: succumb to addiction or confront a global superpower.
In 1839, the Qing Emperor appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu, a man of unwavering integrity and fierce determination, to eradicate the opium trade in Canton, the epicenter of the illicit market. Lin approached his task with revolutionary zeal, demanding that foreign merchants surrender their entire opium stocks. His most dramatic act was confiscating and publicly destroying over 20,000 chests of opium, an estimated 1,200 tons, worth millions of pounds, mixing it with lime and salt and flushing it into the sea. This audacious act was a direct challenge to British sovereignty and economic interests, an unequal declaration that China would no longer tolerate the poison. Lin's decisive action, hailed as a heroic stand by many Chinese, was seen by the British as an outrageous assault on property rights and an insult to the crown, providing the perfect pretext for war. The stage was set for an inevitable, bloody confrontation.
Commissioner Lin's decisive actions sent shockwaves through the foreign merchant community and quickly reached London. Britain, viewing the destruction of the opium as a grave affront to its honor and a violation of international trading rights, issued an ultimatum. They demanded compensation for the seized opium, an apology from the emperor, and an end to all restrictions on trade. For Britain, this was not about opium. It was about upholding the principles of free trade, a cynical euphemism for their right to exploit foreign markets with whatever commodity they chose. For China, it was a battle for national sovereignty, public health, and cultural survival. The clash wasn't just economic. It was a collision of profoundly different worldviews, one rooted in ancient traditions and the other in aggressive industrial and imperial expansion. Diplomacy had failed. War became the inevitable, tragic answer.
In 1840, Britain unleashed its formidable military might upon China, initiating the First Opium War. The conflict was brutally lopsided. The Qing dynasty's outdated military, equipped with antiquated weapons and lacking modern naval technology, was no match for the technologically superior British forces. The Royal Navy's steam-powered gunboats, a marvel of industrial innovation, sailed unopposed up China's rivers, shelling coastal cities and devastating fortifications. British infantry, disciplined and well-armed, swept through Chinese defenses. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a demonstration of overwhelming imperial power, designed to crush resistance and enforce Britain's will. The war was a stark illustration of the devastating consequences of China's isolation and Britain's ruthless determination to protect its illicit drug trade. What hope did China have against such a relentless modern war machine?
The First Opium War ended swiftly and decisively with China's humiliating defeat. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed aboard a British warship, forcing China to concede to Britain's every demand. This was the first of the unequal treaties that would plague China for a century. Under its terms, China was forced to open 5 treaty ports to British trade, including Shanghai and Canton, effectively dismantling its mercantile sovereignty. It had to pay a colossal indemnity for the destroyed opium and the cost of the war. Most significantly, China was compelled to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, establishing a colonial outpost that would endure for 155 years. The The treaty epitomized China's vulnerability and marked the beginning of its century of humiliation, irrevocably altering the balance of power in Asia. How could a single treaty so profoundly change the destiny of nations?
The cession of Hong Kong was a strategic masterpiece for Britain, creating a permanent deep-water port and military base on the Chinese coast. Far from the reach of Qing authority, Hong Kong rapidly transformed into a bustling free port, its strategic location making it the perfect hub for continuing the lucrative opium trade. It became the crown jewel of Britain's Asian empire, a symbol of its economic and military dominance. For China, however, Hong Kong was a festering wound, a stark reminder of its defeat and subjugation. The island, once a sparsely populated fishing village, became a bastion of British power, a gateway for further exploitation, and a constant affront to Chinese national pride. Its very existence served as a testament to the brutal efficacy of Britain's imperial policy, a physical manifestation of a drug empire's dark legacy. Could such an unjust beginning ever lead to true prosperity?
Despite China's defeat and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, the opium trade did not cease. In fact, it surged. The treaty ports, ostensibly for legitimate trade, became conduits for an even greater influx of the drug. British merchants, now operating with legal impunity in designated areas, flooded the market, making opium more accessible and cheaper than ever before. China's government, crippled by war indemnities and the loss of customs revenue, was powerless to stop it. The number of addicts continued to climb, further weakening China's economy and social fabric. The free trade doctrine, championed by Britain, effectively meant the freedom to poison an entire nation for profit. This was not a temporary setback for China. It was a systemic assault that compounded its woes and deepened its humiliation, proving that the war was merely a means to an end, securing the drug market.
The First Opium War and its aftermath sowed deep seeds of resentment and anti-foreign sentiment throughout China. The humiliation of military defeat, the imposition of unequal treaties, and the relentless flow of opium fueled a simmering anger among the Chinese populace. The Qing dynasty, once revered as the embodiment of heavenly rule, lost significant credibility in the eyes of its people, contributing to internal unrest and rebellions. While Britain celebrated its imperial triumph, believing it had opened China to civilization and commerce, the Chinese saw only aggression, exploitation, and the systematic destruction of their society. This growing fury, a collective trauma etched into the national psyche, would inevitably lead to further confrontation. The peace was fragile, built on the shifting sands of injustice and the unyielding will of a desperate empire. Could such deep wounds ever truly heal?
The consequences of this global drug operation were profound, laying the groundwork for London's transformation into the world's financial capital. But at what cost? While the city's coffers swelled with the illicit gains of the opium trade, China reeled under its devastating impact. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 12 million addicts, 2 brutal opium wars that shattered Chinese sovereignty, and an entire nation brought to its knees. This is the story of how a small island nation, driven by insatiable greed, turned addiction into imperial policy, morphing a Christian empire into history's most profitable drug cartel. It's a narrative that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and the enduring legacy of colonial exploitation. The echoes of this dark chapter still resonate, shaping global power dynamics even in the 21st century. Are we truly free from its shadow?
The First Opium War and its aftermath sowed deep seeds of resentment and anti-foreign sentiment throughout China. The humiliation of military defeat, the imposition of unequal treaties, and the relentless flow of opium fueled a simmering anger among the Chinese populace. The Qing dynasty, once revered as the embodiment of heavenly rule, lost significant credibility in the eyes of its people, contributing to internal unrest and rebellions. While Britain celebrated its imperial triumph, believing it had opened China to civilization and commerce, the Chinese saw only aggression, exploitation, and the systematic destruction of their society. This growing fury, a collective trauma etched into the national psyche, would inevitably lead to further confrontation. The peace was fragile, built on the shifting sands of injustice and the unyielding will of a desperate empire. Could such deep wounds ever truly heal? The treaties of Tientsin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, which ended the Second Opium War, tightened China's chains even further. These new treaties forced China to open more treaty ports, legalize the opium trade, grant foreign powers navigation rights on the Yangtze River, and allow foreign envoys to reside in Beijing. Vast swaths of Chinese territory were carved out as concessions to foreign powers, creating zones where European law, not Chinese, prevailed. Missionaries were granted freedom to spread Christianity, further eroding traditional Chinese beliefs. The indemnities imposed were crippling, plunging the Qing dynasty into deeper debt and dependence. China was now an open market, its resources and people at the mercy of foreign powers. The dream of self-sufficiency lay shattered, replaced by an imposed reality of foreign domination. Was there any hope left for the once mighty dragon? The treaties of Tientsin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, which ended the Second Opium War, tightened China's chains even further. These new treaties forced China to open more treaty ports, legalize the opium trade, grant foreign powers navigation rights on the Yangtze River, and allow foreign envoys to reside in Beijing. Vast swaths of Chinese territory were carved out as concessions to foreign powers, creating zones where European law, not Chinese, prevailed. Missionaries were granted freedom to spread Christianity, further eroding traditional Chinese beliefs. The indemnities imposed were crippling, plunging the Qing dynasty into deeper debt and dependence. China was now an open market, its resources and people at the mercy of foreign powers. The dream of self-sufficiency lay shattered, replaced by an imposed reality of foreign domination. Was there any hope left for the once mighty dragon? The treaties of Tientsin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, which ended the Second Opium War, tightened China's chains even further. These new treaties forced China to open more treaty ports, legalize the opium trade, grant foreign powers navigation rights on the Yangtze River, and allow foreign envoys to reside in Beijing. Vast swaths of Chinese territory were carved out as concessions to foreign powers, creating zones where European law, not Chinese, prevailed. Missionaries were granted freedom to spread Christianity, further eroding traditional Chinese beliefs. The indemnities imposed were crippling, plunging the Qing dynasty into deeper debt and dependence. China was now an open market, its resources and people at the mercy of foreign powers. The dream of self-sufficiency lay shattered, replaced by an imposed reality of foreign domination. Was there any hope left for the once mighty dragon?
Imagine presenting irrefutable evidence that contradicts someone's deeply held belief, only for them to cling even more fiercely to their original, incorrect idea. This isn't just frustrating, it's the chilling reality of the backfire effect, a cognitive phenomenon where
When faced with evidence against their beliefs, people can reject the evidence and strengthen their original stance. It's a shocking testament to the power of motivated reasoning. Our brains are wired to protect our worldview, and when that worldview is threatened, we don't always update our beliefs rationally. Instead, we can double down, activating emotional defenses and strengthening the neural pathways associated with the challenged belief. This effect has profound implications for politics, public health, and any attempt to engage in rational discourse. It explains why some people become more entrenched in conspiracy theories or scientific denial despite overwhelming evidence. Uncover the psychological defenses that trigger this powerful resistance to facts and learn how to navigate conversations where reason seems to fail. Understanding the backfire effect is crucial for effective communication and for recognizing the deep human need to protect one's identity, even at the cost of truth.
Before the storm of opium, China was a colossus, a self-sufficient empire at the zenith of its power and cultural influence. For centuries, its highly prized silks, teas, and porcelains captivated the Western world, creating an insatiable demand. Yet, China itself had little interest in European goods, viewing them as inferior. This imbalance meant that Western powers, particularly Britain, had to pay for Chinese luxuries almost exclusively in silver. For Britain, this constant drain of bullion was unsustainable, a gnawing problem for its burgeoning empire. China, the Middle Kingdom, stood aloof, confident in its own superiority, unaware of the insidious plot brewing across the seas. Its markets were closed, its culture vibrant, its future seemingly unassailable. But this self-imposed isolation, ironically, made it a prime target for a desperate, ambitious new power.
The trade imbalance with China was a financial hemorrhage for Britain. Silver flowed eastward in torrents to satisfy the burgeoning European craving for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, with little flowing back. British merchants struggled to find anything of value that China desired in return. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was a crisis for a nation that viewed global trade as the engine of its imperial might. The East India Company, the Crown's de facto agent in Asia, was under immense pressure to find a commodity that could reverse this debilitating silver drain. The solution they devised was not only morally reprehensible, but strategically brilliant in its malevolence. They found their answer in a single, unassuming poppy flower, cultivated thousands of miles away in India, an answer that would forever alter the course of history and redefine the very meaning of trade balance. Enter the East India Company, a corporate entity unlike any other in history. More than just a trading company, it was a state within a state, wielding its own army, minting its own currency, and governing vast territories in India. This colossal enterprise, initially chartered for legitimate trade, gradually evolved into an instrument of imperial domination. It held a virtual monopoly on British trade in Asia, its power unchecked, its ambitions boundless. When the problem of China's trade imbalance arose, it was the company that spearheaded the search for a solution, not with diplomacy, but with a ruthless pragmatism that knew no ethical bounds. This powerful corporation, answerable only to its shareholders and a distant parliament, was about to embark on its most infamous venture, transforming from a mercantile powerhouse into the primary vehicle for a global drug empire. How could such immense power become so corrupted?
The East India Company's journey from trading in spices and textiles to trafficking in narcotics marks a horrifying moral pivot. As the silver drain to China became unsustainable, the company turned its gaze to opium, a substance with long-standing medicinal use but also recognized addictive properties. The transition wasn't sudden. but a gradual descent into calculated depravity, driven by profit motives and imperial necessity. Opium, already cultivated in India, presented an irresistible solution to the trade deficit. It was a product China hadn't asked for, didn't want, and would pay for in silver. This strategic shift fundamentally changed the nature of global commerce, setting a precedent for using illicit means to achieve economic dominance. It redefined the very essence of trade, twisting it into a tool for geopolitical subjugation. The company was no longer just a merchant, it was a drug lord on an unprecedented scale.
With the backing of the British Crown, the East India Company established an iron grip over the entire opium supply chain. In India, they systematically dismantled local control over poppy cultivation, replacing it with a ruthless monopoly. Peasants were coerced, often violently, into growing opium poppies instead of food crops, their livelihoods now tied to the company's insatiable demand for the drug. The processing plants, the transportation networks, the entire infrastructure of addiction all fell under the company's direct control. This wasn't free trade, it was forced production, dictated by imperial decree. The company's vast administrative and military resources ensured compliance, transforming vast swaths of India into a giant opium factory. This centralized, state-sanctioned production line was the engine that would fuel the eventual subjugation of China. How many lives were ruined just to fuel this monstrous profit machine?
Across the fertile plains of Bengal and Bihar, the East India Company enforced a grim transformation. Fields once dedicated to sustenance now bloomed with a harvest of horror, the opium poppy. Indian farmers, many impoverished and indebted, were compelled to cultivate opium, often at gunpoint, for a pittance. Refusal meant severe punishment, confiscation of land, or worse. The company provided advances, ensnaring farmers in a cycle of debt from which escape was near impossible. This wasn't voluntary agriculture, it was a system of forced labor designed to maximize yield for the British Crown's lucrative drug enterprise. The company perfected the art of extraction, ensuring a constant, reliable supply of raw opium to be processed and shipped to China. India became the unwilling engine of an addiction epidemic, its people exploited to create a weapon against another nation. What does it take for a nation to turn its own subjects into instruments of such devastation?
Once harvested and processed, the raw opium began its perilous journey along the poison pipeline. Loaded onto specially designed clipper ships, often under the guise of legitimate cargo, the drug traversed thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean. While the East India Company maintained a facade of deniability, officially selling the opium to private British, American, and Parsi merchants in Calcutta, everyone knew its ultimate destination. These private traders, many of whom were merely fronts for the company's interests, then orchestrated the smuggling operations into China. This sophisticated network, backed by immense capital and naval power, ensured a relentless flow of the addictive substance. It was a logistical marvel of illicit trade, demonstrating the sheer organizational power of the British Empire when directed towards its most nefarious goals. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine global power.